Hey folks, welcome to the DarkHorse podcast. I have the privilege of introducing you to Jeremy Lee Quinn, who is an investigative photojournalist from California. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm really pleased to talk to you because it turns out that you have been deeply involved in studying a phenomenon of which many of us have become fascinated, or with which many of us have become fascinated. So tell us.
And I didn't know it. And that was the shock to me, is that I didn't know it was there. I've been a member of the media for 17 years, working mainstream from New York to California. Started my career out as a small market reporter in West Virginia. But I've always been aware of what I thought were talking points, and I didn't understand what was going on until I was on the streets. And that is what I realized, is that there's a big difference between the reality we're getting from the screen and the reality that's on the street right now. And that's because there's not a lot of people who are reporting on the street. And I noticed it right off first day I was out in that weekend of May 30th, May 31st. I was in Santa Monica, California, and I went to support Black Lives Matter and protest and add my voice in Santa Monica. And very quickly, it turned out to be something quite different than I expected. Now, so for 6 months, I've pursued this story, and there have been lots of obstacles when it came to getting anybody to talk about it or deal with the evidence on the street honestly in a empirical discussion about what the hell is going on. And I think a lot of people across the country feel that way. And I'm not surprised that it hasn't stopped. I kept saying, I said, it's not going to end with the election. There's other stuff going on. So.
Well, in a very meaningful way, I would say, it didn't start with the George Floyd protests either. So you tell me whether this is what you see, but I've been living in the Pacific Northwest now since 2002, and there is a thread involved in anarchism that joined forces and caught fire when the Black Lives Matter protests broke out this year. But that thread is far from new, and so the expectation that immediate events are going to cause it to settle down seem far-fetched.
Well, it actually goes back even as far as 1986 and 1987. When you talk about two currents of anti-fascism and anarchism, and you could look at each event and separate it into an anti-fascist action and an anarchist action. For example, in Portland, just yesterday, I shouldn't date it but this week in Portland, they set up a new autonomous zone and they succeeded. And that is an anarchist action in the sense that it's insurrectionary. It is an insurrectionary anarchist action. I was in Sacramento just last weekend, and it was an anti-fascist action in the sense that they went specifically to counter-protest, which was really launch an attack, which was labeled as community defense against the Make America Great Again, the MAGA normies, really, that were at the Sacramento Capitol, but they're aligned with the Proud Boys. And that gives enough significance in the rad Twitter population to pitch it as community defense. If the Proud Boys are there, we have to shut it down. We go where they go. Do not give them the space to organize. That's a credo that ties all the way back to 1987, 1986 in Minneapolis, of all places.
So we're talking about a multi-generation phenomenon here. This is likely not the same people from 1986 who are involved in these actions now, especially given how young so many of them seem to be.
Well, you'd be surprised, actually, that there is multi-generational involvement. And I think that that's what people don't understand is radical movements, of course, go back to the 60s. The folks who were teenagers in 1987, 1986, they were mentored by the folks in the 60s. So there are people who hold on to insurrectionary radicalism and pass it on to the younger generation. So much so that the largest network out there that's operating right now is called Torch Antifa. And torch isn't just burning everything to the ground. It also means passing the torch to the next generation. And this is all stuff that's actually quite transparent. So if you're on the internet and you're on Twitter, there are a couple of groups that are being explicit. Berkeley Antifa, Sacramento Antifa, especially this last week, they were extremely transparent about what they were doing, how they were doing it, and that they were attacking first.
So let's go back a second. I have been wondering about the overlap between the so-called anti-fascist part of this and the anarchist part. And it's confusing because in some ways the anti-fascist part makes some deliberate reference to anarchism and keeps its distance. It's almost like it's modulating the connection. And even the symbols seem to be ambiguous. So, in other words, there are a lot of anarchist A's spray painted around Portland, but there are also quite a number of Antifa A's, and the nature of spray paint is such that you have to be paying very close attention to register the distinction. So what can you tell us about it?
Well, there are part of the confusion is no accident. This is shifting identities and affiliation makes it really difficult to even talk about or even say who's out there. There's one thing you can say that they will agree on, because part of it is the character assassination of you don't know anything, you don't know what you're talking about. This is a subculture you do not belong to. Even for folks like us, like I'm a 2016 Bernie voter, I voted Green Party before. I'm not somebody who they like to portray. As soon as you hear a voice of dissent, that guy is alt-right. That guy is a troll from the alt-right and so forth, a white supremacist. All these labels get thrown around to shut down the conversation before it can happen. And the press, understandably, is completely perplexed. They didn't even know what words to use and couldn't agree on them back in June. And part of the issue with that is, of course, the President of the United States coming out and citing an incident in Buffalo where a senior citizen activist was pushed down by the police and tweeting that he might be an Antifa operative. And when that happens, all of a sudden the discussion becomes scorched earth. You can't even bring up the word Antifa. I couldn't use it for about 4 months because even in my head, I thought that's just a right-wing talking point. But when you Google Antifa 2017, you will see, and a lot of publications named, the Washington Post editorial board in 2017 condemned the tactics of Antifa as helping the very hate that they say they're shutting down. The Atlantic, the Daily Beast, 2017. You can Google these publications. We knew what this was back then, but something shut us up between the end of 2017 and now in examining what these currents of radicalism, anarchism, and anti-fascism are and how they work side by side. And that goes back actually to the very beginning of the 20th century. And a lot of the anarchists like to cite 1930s Spain, especially. There's this affinity towards the anarchists against Franco, and they even used Spanish words. One in the anarchist scene, insurrecto is used for those who are the insurrectionists, the insurrectionary anarchists. Now they like to, when the New York Times piece came out that was that cited my work and was talking about insurrectionary anarchism, it was a huge gaslighting on Twitter of you don't know what you're talking about. And I fielded contacts within the movement who said, yeah, they're insurrectos. That's what we call ourselves. And people who are aligned with that, with insurrectionary anarchism. Since 1987, you've had fights in the skidhead gang scene between anti-racist skinheads and neo-Nazi skinheads. That's when the anti-fascism began. But along with it came the anarchism identification, the insurrectionist identification. And it all begins in Minneapolis, actually, of all places.
All right. Well, we'll come back to that in a second. I do want to highlight this point that you make about the fact that there is this barrage of arguments that you will face if you attempt to use these terms, and it doesn't matter whether you're using them correctly or not. The response is always the same, and I noticed this when Evergreen broke down on the basis of an anarchist plan. It was clearly anarchist in the literal sense of the term. And at the point that I alleged that what had happened was that the campus had engaged in experiments in anarchy, I was accused of not knowing what I was talking about, of mistaking anarchy for mayhem or chaos, and that just simply wasn't the case. Now, there was mayhem and chaos, but the point is what caused it was anarchism, right? They stood down the police and they allowed the protesters to take over the role of policing, and it went very predictably. But in any case, everyone who engages these terms ought to simply expect that no matter how correctly they use them, they will be told they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, I think you can use insurrectionist because that's what they refer to themselves collectively as. First of all, it's revolutionary politics. Revolutionary politics dates back to the 60s. They will admit to that. Radicalism you could use, but I think they speak poorly for radicals, quite frankly, and even anarchists. And that's where you get into the issue. Classical anarchism, and anarchism as a personal philosophy of individual freedoms, is a profound and profoundly American in the sense that Henry David Thoreau wrote Civil Disobedience, and we have a profound tradition of peaceful anarchism, anarcho-pacifism. And that, of course, with MLK and Gandhi, that's what I was raised on. And my folks met at UC Berkeley in the 60s. And so I'm raised with this anarcho-pacifistic background. But the insurrectionary anarchists have pitted themselves since the 90s against anybody who is preaching anarcho-pacifism as peace police, that you are aligned with the state and you are an appeaser to the state, and therefore you are even more dangerous than the police itself. It's one of the arguments that is made. I don't even want to mention some of the publications, because the ones that are the most intolerant of any view besides their own happen to be the most influential right now. They catch the most fire. And you see that being enacted on the streets with the idea of diversity of tactics. And there's no such thing as a bad protester, that we will not police each other. We will accept all tactics. And under that credo, unfortunately, it's the most violent and most ambitiously violent, I should say, that takes the day and has far more resounding effects than we realize, because then we can't even talk. We can't even discuss or point out where our possible flaws are within a movement. And this is something that's being debated within the insurrectionary anarchist community itself. You have different types of anarchism. You have red anarchism is social revolutionary. And my problem with it is that it's also social authoritarian. When you go into the streets, it's the social authoritarianism of you shall not film unless we approve you. And 2 reporters from a local station in Portland were physically ejected from the new autonomous zone in Portland and just the other day. And there's proof of that on Twitter, and just how the hive will surround somebody that doesn't belong, and bam, it's umbrellas in your face. It's you don't belong here. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out. It's in your face. And I've seen a lot of it from coast to coast, from Portland to DC, and the San Francisco Bay Area is where I've been mostly, because it's where I'm from. And Berkeley Antifa and Sacramento Antifa have made no bones about what they're. See, the freedom of this is they actually use the word Antifa in their name. So you can't get dinged when finally they, on their Twitter accounts, are admitting to what they're doing. Then you can't get dinged on that. But as far as the scene, insurrectionist or insurrectionism under anarchism is accurate. But there are people who consider themselves classical anarchists, or even armchair anarchists, or anarchists that don't leave their computer, or that have read everything, or intellectual anarchists and academic anarchists. And so you get all of you have to field all of these objections all over the left part of the political spectrum just for trying to discuss it. And disclaimer after disclaimer, I have to put in constantly saying, look, I'm not trying to go against anybody here. I'm trying to understand. I'm just trying to have a conversation about what's going on.
You're being a journalist. You're trying to report what's actually taking place, and you're facing these arguments, which I must say I've been familiar with since Occupy. I do want to highlight, you mentioned diversity of tactics. I was just about to mention it myself. It's one of these phrases that the first time you hear it, you don't quite get the full significance of what's being said. But the idea that somehow in this space, any attack on what is loosely understood to be the enemy is considered valid, no matter how dangerous or immoral it might be understood to be in another context. And what that means is that the movement, on the one hand, takes no responsibility for the sum total of what is done under its banner, and at another level is like a bad brainstorming session where no idea is too dumb or too wrong to find itself brought into the world in physical form. And so, you know, we are always facing this question of, why are you allowed to engage in violence against a courthouse or people defending it, right? Why are you allowed to do this? And the answer is, well, we're mostly not doing that. Well, what does mostly not doing that, even mean? It's obviously a preposterous claim. At some level, if you're participating in a protest that you know full well sometime around 11 o'clock is going to start attacking a courthouse with explosives, then in some sense you're taking responsibility for that, even if you don't recognize it. And at some level, we have to hold you responsible for joining a movement that recognizes no limits on its legitimate action. Is that unfair?
They know it. They laugh about it on Twitter quite openly. The other thing that I have is various Twitter accounts where I'm connected, and there was a movement of no comrades under a certain number, and they wanted to boost comrades. So I just jumped on Twitter, got a bunch of comrades, and I could see the jokes, and they laughed that we're even having this conversation in regards to what is right and what is wrong, because the whole system is wrong. So if you can laugh at us for even breaching the conversation, then it's part of the subculture. It's like,
laughing at us is one of the things that they have right?
Well,
we are far too slow to catch up to what this is and what it wants, and to simply say, no, you're not entitled to destroy our mechanism of governance because you have some utopian notion that if we can just get rid of it, things will be better, right? That's not your right. You don't have the right to chase people, to wake them in the middle of the night in their homes and harass them for crimes that they have not committed. This is not your right, and we have to say no. But at some level, we're just really late to the party discussing what is actually being contemplated.
My dad always says to me, he says, we on the left, we just have the hardest time saying no. Why can't we say no to certain things? And the first month that I was out there, I said, look, I just want to give disclaimer after disclaimer. I switched my profile pictures to all black. I did everything. I support this. I know we need radical change. I know we do. But I don't know that this is, if we don't talk about what's going on and how we're doing it as part of the public conversation, then not only are we just not saying no, we're not even looking.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what I've been saying for years now is that we absolutely need radical change, and we can't afford revolution. Radical change without revolution, or revolutionary change without revolution, is basically where I think we have to go, just simply to survive. But the point is, even that gets me tarred as some kind of a right-winger in this group. Even the recognition that radical change is necessary for us to survive is simply too tame. It is not destructive enough to be credible.
Well, yeah, you're what is called a reformist. And being a reformer when it comes to police or government or the entire nation is off the table with this current movement. And they've been able to spin that. But how long is it going to carry on? There are people that are really dedicated in specific geographical areas in this country. And that's what I think people don't understand and why it's been so hard. And the national media hasn't even touched it. A little on the right, but with all these different misunderstandings and propagandizing in terms of their political viewpoint. But there's vast regional, and this is 24 local stories. It's not one big national story. The scene in Portland, though they communicate with the Bay Area, it's still a very different animal. Washington, D.C. as well, Minneapolis. Those are the 4 sort of nexus points across the country. And it's no accident. Again, it has to do with history and how these, as one anarchist who contacted me told me, he said, what people don't understand is it seems new. It's new to you, but it's not new. This is 33 years of framework organizing. And what is now known as Antifa, in its complete identity, is anti-fascist action, but it's also anarchist anti-fascist action. Anti-fascist action was called anti-racist action in the United States starting in 1987. In Minneapolis, a group of anti-racist skinheads called the Baldies wanted to expand into a network that was nationwide because everybody was dealing with the same problem, which was ethno-nationalist, actual neo-Nazis, called the White Knights in Minneapolis. That was the first to arise. And I have discussions with one of the original members of the Baldies, and another wants nobody to talk to me at all. So there's
wait. The Baldies, just for my clarification, the Baldies were the anti-racist skinheads. Is this right?
Correct.
Okay.
They were a multi-ethnic group in Minneapolis that rose up when the White Knights.
And the White Knights are connected to the Klan, presumably?
Yeah, well, so they were basically neo-Nazis, and there's Klan affiliation. Metzger, this guy who recently died, was a sort of old school neo-Nazi that would recruit young people. And so the youth scene, especially around the punk scene and concerts and so forth, was very, very much enveloped by the struggle of you're either this or that. There were neo-Nazis, and then there were the ARA, the anti-racist action skinheads said, look, you're with us or you're against us. This is an existential threat on our buses, at our clubs. And they would go up to folks who were neo-Nazis and say, look, if we see you, if you're a neo-Nazi next time we see you, it's over. Just be aware. And so they see that as one of the sort of nascent victories for the cause, because they did put down actual neo-Nazis and stop them from taking the streets of Minneapolis in the late 80s. That extended into the 90s, and the organization broke up in the late 90s, but then that framework still stays intact, those relationships. And with the rise of Twitter and the internet, you had Rose Antifa in the city of Portland being formed in 2007. Now, in between, you have probably the most dramatic anarchist action, which takes place at the WTO. And that's folks from Eugene who took on the Black Bloc tactics. And the Black Bloc tactic at first was widely used in the green anarchism scene as well. When I covered tree sitters at UC Berkeley back in the 2000s, one of the guys who was sort of, going from tree to tree was in Black Bloc. And they worked on a similar ideological and tactical framework. The Black Bloc, by the way, comes from Germany. And that first was put in practice in 1987 as well, when Reagan visited West Berlin and there were Black Bloc riots. And those anarchists, according to one of my sources, actually came to the United States after that and met with anti-racist action and anarchists that were insurrectionists and gave a workshop on Black Bloc technique. And their first stop was Minneapolis. Their second stop was Portland.
Interesting. Now, there's something here I want to capture, and I don't know how to do it. I've experienced it, I've seen it, I've thought a great deal about it, but it does not lend itself to a proper description. And it strikes me that the reason is because actually this anarchism stuff is a bit deeper than most people would imagine. There's something about the way that it spreads that is, I think, just matter of fact, contagious. And the way that it, I hate to use the language of disease because that's something that people do when they are setting up other humans for violence. But that's not my point here. My point here is really that there is something about this that takes over things. It drives away anything that will hold its ground. It captures anything that doesn't know how to defend its perspective. And so, on the one hand, I see anarchists having become a problem, for example, for Chris Hedges, right? Chris Hedges would also be dismissed as a reformer, though, like me, Chris Hedges is quite clear about the degree to which there are structural problems in civilization that need to be addressed. Let's just say, I don't think reformer is a proper label for him or for me or anybody else who recognizes the full scope of the problem that civilization has in the 21st century. Likewise, Derek Jensen is challenged by Black Bloc anarchists for various positions, for example, on the meaning of biological sex. So there's a way in which it has an immune system that does not listen to voices that are sympathetic to the idea that there is a problem when those voices say anarchism is not the solution, right? And at the same time, any movement that is in the neighborhood of the left gets taken over and co-opted. So Occupy, for example, started out as a protest against financial recklessness in 2008 and government bailouts that caused it to be amplified. And that was how it began. But then what people on the outside who weren't participating did not realize was that anarchism infused it very quickly and took it over and turned its message meaningless. So to the extent that it was a very hopeful moment in which the world might have woken up to some shenanigans that were actually decreasing the well-being of most Americans, for example, and people across the world, instead what they got was the impression that Occupy was itself just simply a bunch of juvenile utopians who didn't know what they wanted.
Yeah, well, anarchism itself, and we have to clarify, of course I'm going to get nailed anyway, but insurrectionary anarchism as opposed to anarchism in general, anarchism has so many different, it's very, very amendable to different struggles and ideologies. So you have anarcho-communists, you have people who are anarcho-primitivists, who are green anarchists that have more, you have even people who are more anarcho-spiritualists that use it as a personal philosophy, which is more of how I see anarchism in regards to my own anarcho-pacifism. So it can be used as individual. Anarcho-libertarianism is another. We do have folks who are, the Boogaloo is a classic example of this. Folks that embrace an anarcho perspective that are actually from what we would consider to be the right of the political spectrum. And the press is completely mystified by this. I think the libertarian press has figured it out, but to just say all Boogaloo are far right, or we keep saying anybody with a gun is far right, or so forth, it's a lot more complicated than that. And anarchism is just it can be passed around, because the good part of it is about individual freedom and individual accountability. So the old school anarchists that I've had conversations with, and I've interviewed some for my podcast as well, and Well, one of them, a classical anarchist up in Vancouver, who was one of the founders of Occupy, told me in his accent, he said, "If I hate it when people talk about categories, it makes me want to grab my revolver." And so there's this classical romanticism about being a pure anarchist, but in today's society, especially with Twitter and Facebook groups and subgroups, you have all these, it can be abbreviated too, AN-COM, anarcho-communist, AN-PRIM, anarcho-primitivist. So it is very flexible. And as a Twitter identity, we see ideas and identifications being passed along. Now, the question is, well, what do you do with it? What do you do with your anarchism? And I would say that after months and months of being embedded and at these marches and seeing how things develop and how people are communicating, how it's playing, and we hadn't even talked about the social justice movement at all and how it's worked its way. It has been compatible, or in my view, not compatible with that. But what I've come to understand is that there's a specific authoritarianism, a social authoritarianism that we're witnessing with the insurrectors, with the insurrectionists. And that's everything from the umbrella being shoved in your face if you try to film to, well, I'll put it this way. In Sacramento, when we were marching this last weekend, there was a volley with the police. It starts off with a shield push against the police, and the piece of propaganda that they like to say, see, look, the police have their backs to the Proud Boys and to the MAGA people. Look, like it's this offense. No, the cops and the Klan go hand in hand. And it's like, well, no, you're attacking them, and you're the ones attacking. The Proud Boys are just standing there. This was Sacramento. I'm not going to speak on it. Disclaimer again. I'm not speaking on behalf of every Proud Boy. I'm saying what I saw in Sacramento, what I've seen in the San Francisco Bay Area from the Antifa, Sacramento, and Berkeley Antifa factions in the limited time that I have been with them, because this has been going on since 2016 in the Bay Area. Right after Trump was elected was when the first riot started in the Bay Area. So that was November, of, I'm losing it, 2016, right?
Yep.
And so these conflicts moved into the university at UC Berkeley, of course, as we all know, with the free speech, right-wing movement of coming into the university and those being shut down by Black Bloc practitioners. And again, Black Bloc, I have to define, because they ding me on this all the time, that Black Bloc is a tactic. So it's easily used. And quite frankly, we have to expect that every technique that we have let slide for the last 6 months is now being passed to the other side of the political spectrum. And I can get into that, how I've seen Guy Fawkes masks and people dressed in black now at Stop the Steal protests. So those tactics are out of the bag now. And we've let them slide as a society. This is not a right-wing or a left-wing thing. This is, as a society, do we agree on what is acceptable to allow without saying anything? And that's the issue, is that we're not talking about. So when I'm in Sacramento and I see this happen, and it's not either not reported at all or misreported or focused, the local affiliates, one of them focused on a Proud Boy who was in a Santa suit who sprayed mace and had a Bowie knife, and he pulled it out. And that was their headline for ABC in the Bay Area. Well, what about are we not going to tell the rest of the story that there was an attack? No, they did. It's what we call burying the lead, and we're getting really good at it on the left right now, is that all that information is at the end where very few people dare, who attention spans dare tread. So at the front, we're putting this stuff that is socially okay for me to talk about. And then the more difficult stuff at that ABC Bay Area article is at the very bottom, which is that the Black Bloc then left the Capitol and systematically destroyed cars, bashed out windows, kicked in review mirrors, and slashed tires to any car that had an American flag or a Trump sticker or anything that was remotely right wing. And it was I was there. I have video of this. I should mention publicreport.org is the site that I run, in which I from a nonpartisan, empirical, just scientific view, I just want to take a look at what's happening. So even though I've uttered a few opinions of my own on this cast, on the actual site, unless noted, I am just taking the evidence and trying to tell people from the street what I have witnessed. And it's all evidence-based. You'll see photos and video. And I have the video of Sacramento. I haven't released it yet, in which I was in the Black Bloc, and they admit it, though. Berkeley Antifa, Sacramento Antifa, they said they have pictures of the cars on their Twitter feed, and they say, this is what we did. This was a necessary act of community defense against the Proud Boys who have terrorized us. That's their position. I've asked them to provide evidence of that position. I haven't heard back yet. But.
All right. So there are a couple things that we need to go back and just collect here, because really, most of my audience will have some familiarity with anarchism and Antifa, but there's a lot of what you're saying that will be mysterious, I have the sense. So on the one hand, we have tactics, right? So Black Bloc is a tactic, right? It's a tactic that obscures, it both creates an identity, but that identity is not individual, right? So if you are looking at a bunch of people who are dressed in black or obscuring their faces, they largely know who each other are. It is hard for those on the outside, including the police, to identify them individually, which actually plays into some of what happened here in Portland, where apparently protesters were taken off the streets in order to figure out who they were before they were released, as federal indictments were sought. So it was necessary to establish their identity because they were obscuring it. But anybody can use that tactic, right? If you're out to violate the law in pursuit of a cause, then that tactic is one you might avail yourself of. And actually our domestic Black Bloc, as I understand it, picked up that tactic from Europeans. Am I correct?
Correct. It was first used in Germany, in West Berlin.
All right. So we have all of these tactics, and we have all of these factions of anti-fascists and anarchists that believe in different future worlds. But in some sense, what they share is a belief that this world has to be torn down in order to get where we're going. Now, they regard people like me, who would tell them, actually, game theoretically, what you're saying makes no sense. We are reformers, therefore easily dismissed, even if what we're saying is true. We're going to have to destroy civilization to discover the truth of it, even though it's perfectly obvious if you understand the dynamics. But nonetheless, the problem is that you have an alignment of those who would tear down civilization as it stands in pursuit of something that cannot happen. And that can even align people. We have BLM, which has deep Marxist roots. Marxism is not anarchism, right? But Marxists and anarchists can team up on the project of destroying civilization in order to replace it with something, and then they will fight over whether or not it is to be replaced with some completely horizontal, ground-up phenomenon or some top-down Marxist phenomenon. And in effect, those of us on the outside of this movement have to understand that what we are facing is a temporary agreement about destruction, right? And then a massive disagreement about what's on the other side. And that, frankly, none of the people who are making these arguments are in a position to understand how you would build something different than the society we have. Never mind how hard it would be to build something that worked better than what we've got, right? In other words, we have something that has the basic functionality, and you can dismiss the idea of changing it as simple reform and therefore not good enough. But the chances you'll build something much, much worse are spectacular. So we who are trying to figure out how seriously to take this have to recognize that the only thing that this amorphous, multi-tactical phenomenon agrees on is destroying what works, right? And then they have a big disagreement about what comes next.
Right. They agree on no compromise. That's what's agreed on right now. As far as what comes next, that was brought up in the Times article where the woman who had interviewed me asked, they seem very good very, very good at tearing things down. The question is what they intend to build in its place. And there's little agreement on that, I would say, but that's a tough one. But the idea that the whole system has to be thrown out because it's colonialist and it's oppressive, it's a very narrow understanding. And, of course, a lot of the people that I've been out on the street with are very young. And up in Portland, as young as, 13 or 14. When I was in New York, in Rochester, I came late to a protest. And what was remarkable about Rochester, New York, when it was activated, was they had all the outside trappings of Portland. All the tactics had gone viral. They had a shield line, check. Gas masks, check. Everybody had helmets, umbrellas, skateboards. They had everything. And this kid is coming by on a skateboard, and I was like, I asked him, "Hey, has the protest finished or started? What's the situation?" He was like, "Oh yeah, we just painted murderers on the asphalt, but it's still going. You can go on." And he was literally like 12 years old on a skateboard. It's getting very young, and that's by design. The anti-racist action insurrectos, the sort of old school guard that is contemporary to those who were teenagers in the 80s, they actually spoke in Lansing, Michigan, or no, Ann Arbor. Sorry, it was in Ann Arbor, and they told a group that you need to go to the high schools. Flyer the high schools is the exact quote, because high school kids have this totally different. It's one thing to work with college kids. Get to the high schools was their advice. That's 2017 during post-Charlottesville. Richard Spencer, an actual white nationalist, is at work doing his thing. And that was their advice to anti-fascist organizers at that time. And we see that. There is, at the Bellingham Youth Liberation front page, they've tweeted a picture of them flyering Bellingham High School. And their flyer says, "Are you radical? Are you under the age of 25? And it has the communist sickle on it and the anarchist logo. And it says, "Join the Youth Liberation Front," who's one of the biggest actors, of course, in your area in the Pacific Northwest, and now has chapters down by us in the Bay Area. There's now NorCal Youth Liberation Front, and there's I hope I'm not giving them too much of a name check, but there are a lot of organizations, and that's what people also need to understand is when Sacramento Antifa on their blog admitted to what they did, which was not just breaking out a bunch of cars, but they actually beat up a young couple. And that was similar to what I saw on October the 17th when MAGA normies were beaten up unilaterally. It was a unilateral attack without defense. But they admit to this on their blog as well, that this is what they're doing. But they're starting young, and that's the strategy. It's by design.
So let me ask you something about that. I'm trying to understand what I'm seeing with respect to who is being arrested. And we have a very interesting phenomenon here in Portland, which I'm sure you know about, and I'm sure is not unique, where there is a bail fund. People who wish to signal their credibility on the left donate to a bail fund that then bails people out who've been arrested for violence or property damage or whatever. And that means that their mugshots are available. And it's actually quite disturbing. Now, I'm hesitant to infer too much because I would imagine that if you've been out protesting and maybe you've been tear gassed and you're then photographed after you've been arrested, it's probably not the best photograph ever taken of you. But it's hard to avoid the impression that there might be something marginal about the people who are getting arrested. In other words, that the movement may have captured the attention of people who aren't particularly good at limiting themselves. And so I'm wondering about flyering the high schools. In every high school, there are violent, uncontrollable kids who cause trouble. If you present them a cause which makes their natural tendency to do harm, to break rules for its own sake. And if you say, actually, you're doing this for a good cause, it strikes me that it's going to pick up a lot of those people who would be doing the same stuff anyway, just because they bridle against the rules, and they will do it under this flag. And so when we encounter these very young people engaged in violent, destructive behavior, and we try to understand it through an ideological lens of anarchism and, a resentment of colonialism or whatever, we're sort of missing the point, which is they're destined to be two categories. One category is people who have been persuaded of something and are acting this way because they think that it is the solution to a problem that they have come to understand is important. Now, they're still wrong, right? This behavior is destructive, and as we were just talking about, it's not going to lead anywhere. There's not even agreement on where it should lead. But nonetheless, an ideological person is very different from somebody who is dysregulated and violent and destructive and has signed on because this gives a kind of pseudo-coherence to what they're doing. So do you see both of those things on the ground?
Well, the generational gap is interesting because only in San Francisco have I seen the old guard. In pictures, I've seen some of the old guard insurrectos post pictures that I identify them at the back of the crowd. But in San Francisco on October the 17th, I actually followed two older generation folks who were mentoring these young kids who were teenagers. So, and they looked twice their side. The guy was he was very tall, and he had an anarchist tattoo on his right here. And there was another fellow who had a Sharp jacket. Sharp is one of the original anti-racist organizations, skinheads against racial prejudice. And these two had a flock of young teenagers who were in Black Bloc. I saw them go after a young man. It was an Asian guy who came up, and he was filming what was going on. And so these kids chased him away, and then they just kept chasing him. They chased him all the way down a block. The only people that were following were me and these two older guys to see what would happen. Well, eventually the perp who had taken a picture was hid behind the police, and they were like, fuck you, you need the pigs and all this stuff. And then they come back, and the younger guy says to the older guy, man, I was about to kick him and went to the fucking pigs. And so there's this mentorship that I think people don't see, and it's important to understand that if the idea itself, the ideas are considered to be so pure and so righteous that they will be passed generation to generation, and that it's when there are so many when it's fertile ground, and so many people are disenfranchised or just disenchanted or just young. There's a lot to gravitate towards, especially when you have older folks wanting to connect you to a tradition of a righteous tradition. And that's what people don't see, is that there's a history here. There are organizational elders. And then there are young people who are just doing their own thing. And that's what we see in Portland too, is that the youth are kind of saying to everybody else, we're doing this on our own in some cases. Because again, you have different factions in Portland. But the young people are very independent. At least they say that they are on Twitter. There was a split. I mentioned to you on August the 6th, a bunch of insurrectionary anarchist groups went separate from BLM. And Robert Evans, who's one of the reporters, actually tweeted the flyer and said, this is the first time that they're going to be going out on their own. Well, we have seen some divisions, so much so that we haven't even talked about Black Lives Matter so far in this podcast. And I don't even know that the three women who started Black Lives Matter, if they really understand the level of tactical coordination that's on the street in this other direction. Because the three women who started Black Lives Matter, who are part of Black Lives Matter Global, are very accomplished activists who are working in a very public and capitalistic forum in a sense. And it's pulling in all these endorsements and all this money. But these other groups that are on the ground are of a very different world and ideology. So much so that there's been a schism in Black Lives Matter in the sense that local chapters that are the front, say they're the front lines, issued a statement recently in which they objected to one of the three being appointed the executive leader without any sort of democratic process, and they're asking about funding and allocations of funds. So there's all these divisions, even within divisions, that gets extremely complicated. I don't know if I answered your question. What was it again?
Well, I was trying to understand the nature of the recruiting of young people into this movement and whether it's covering, whether basically if you were I'm trying to find a synonym for a punk because I don't want to demonize, ideological punks as it were. Maybe I even identify with them. But if you were just a punk kid, right, who didn't want to behave yourself because you like tearing shit up, right?
Yeah.
And then somebody's flyering your high school saying, are you sick of colonialism? Do you want to do something important? Right? It's, it's an analog for, the pitch that the military might make to capture, young men who, are itching to, I don't know, shoot up some baddies or whatever. So that those people could be brought in and effectively would be used. So I guess I'm seeing you have civilization, right? Let's agree that it's broken, right? It's very productive, but it's broken. And it's also desperately unfair in many ways. And so a discussion I never properly hear is, are you better off in a broken civilization that's very productive and doesn't distribute stuff fairly, or would you be better off without that civilization in something that fairly distributed a much less productive set of gains, if it distributed them fairly, right? And I think, unfortunately, the situation that we're in is just very, very clear, which is actually, even being unfairly treated, you are getting a tremendous number of benefits from this civilization. And the only rational thing to do is to try to make it fair, rather than to upend it in hopes of creating something fair, which will undoubtedly be really unproductive. But nonetheless, there's some adult conversation to have about what works, what doesn't, what part of this is actually a racket, and what we might do about it. And then there's what I would say is not an adult conversation, which is, let's tear this down because we've got all kinds of ideas about what we might do instead, right? Never mind that we don't agree on them. And then within that thread, you've got adults who maybe have a deeper insight into, some long-standing tradition of anarchism, right, that's actually ideological, and they are recruiting kids who are, troubled. And so anyway, you've got kind of a mirror inside of the anarchist or the insurrectionist anarchist movement that has, would-be adults and, mentees mixing. And I'm wondering how much of the violence and destruction, at some level, kids don't know stuff. I'm sure you didn't know stuff when, you were a young kid. I can say the same thing of myself. And it's, it's natural to be trying on all kinds of viewpoints and perspectives. At the point that you are, firing explosives into a federal building, something else has happened. And I'm trying to understand how it is that kids who, yes, might be trying on the idea that civilization is just so broken that it can't be rescued, but should be trying it on as an abstraction, are actually succeeding in attacking the structures of the adult world, and they are being taken way too seriously by people like our mayor here, who has, been effectively coddling and protecting them, even though they're threatening to tear down something that all of us, including the protesters, are depending on.
they enjoy it. That's the part of it that is elusive. Is that they don't just enjoy it. I would almost say that there is an addictive quality, and I think that's a word that I've been looking for a while, because what I realized in Portland after the win against the federal government, and the federal government wasn't going to come out anymore at the courthouse, I was there for those next days, and people didn't know what to do. They were antsy. You had a couple older generational pacifist types on megaphones, so that was very annoying. So when August 6th, they decide we're just going to go out on our own and attack this other precinct in another part of town and go through these other neighborhoods. That, to me, was a signal that we just want to keep doing this. That's all. We just want to keep going. Because there was no moment of, okay, let's reflect. We just had a big win against the federal government. What are we looking at strategically, philosophically? What discussions are we having? It wasn't that. It was, the word I used was jonesing. I said the helmet heads are jonesing right now, because literally I was walking up and down in front of the courthouse, and they were hanging on the fence, peering over. People were shooting some fireworks. Somebody burned an American flag. There was just nothing to do. You had all this pent-up energy that now they weren't coming out to play. The feds weren't coming out to play. The police weren't coming out. Nobody was coming out. Well, what now? What now? So we just start burning stuff. That's what happened. And then a couple of days later, you go out and you burn stuff somewhere else. And then you go through this neighborhood. So there is an addictive quality to how this is being enjoyed by the people who are partaking in it. I think that's the most accurate characterization that I can assess from DC, from what I saw in DC to Portland and the San Francisco Bay Area. I saw that same addictive quality. It's not everywhere. These movements and these Antifa Atlanta was totally different from what I saw. And again, disclaimer after disclaimer, different social movements in Louisville. Denver is extremely diverse. You have actual Marxists with hammer and sickle flags. And I marched next to a guy who had a full arm tattoo of Joseph Stalin. And those guys are called tankies, the Stalinists, who are statists. So if you're an anarchist, you're kind of against the people who are the statists. But as you said earlier, as you put those divisions behind you, and that goes to that Ann Arbor conference. One of the two brothers from Ohio that were originally in the anti-racist action, they said it didn't matter what you were. When we had to come together against a common cause, the White Knights, Metzger, these bona fide white supremacists, it didn't matter if you were a Maoist or a Stalinist or what have you. We put all that aside and we worked together to fight the common enemy. And I think we've seen a resurgence under the administration of Donald Trump as they identified that as the common fascist enemy. And so everything was put down as far as divisions and banners for the most part. There's actually one funny story in Portland where I saw a couple Black Bloc anarchists kick out the revolutionary communists from LA. And they were there with their banner for 2 days. And this is like day 65 of the protest. And this group of youngsters are like, get out of here with your fucking banner and your fucking website. Coming in here day 65. We all know that RevCom is bullshit. And they chased them out and said, come back as individuals.
Come back as individuals.
Yeah, put your ban away. Come back as individuals.
Yeah, that's funny with the Black Bloc, which is this obviously de-individuating methodology.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. So I must say, I've thought a lot about the LARPing aspect. That there's a lot of role playing and gamesmanship, and I actually talked to a federal officer who described how the federal officers had actually war-gamed out both sides of their conflict. And actually, he was amazingly humane. It was weird. He was obviously frustrated at, having projectiles launched at him every night, but he felt protective of the anarchists and felt that he's like, look, we could overrun these people and put down this attack any day of the week, but we can't do it without hurting them, and I'm going to feel a terrible sense of loss if they get hurt, right? So anyway, I found that interesting. But he described the wargaming, where half the time they had been on the Antifa side, and then half the time they'd played the role of officers, and he described how much fun it was on both sides, right? And how the tactics had evolved. And in any case, so the LARPing, I think there's something very deep here, and it is a kind of, high stakes LARPing. But addiction, that's new to me, and I agree, it resonates right away, that there's a sense in which if an individual goes and attacks a federal courthouse, they get arrested, and whatever dopamine rush they got is then followed by some terrible hell. So it doesn't happen a lot. But if a group flying a banner figures out how to attack a courthouse night after night, and it's all very spectacular and invigorating, right? And you know just who the enemy is. It's those people, dressed in riot gear on the other side. And you don't need to worry about the fact that they're human beings and that they have families and that, yes, some of them are bastards, but some of them are certainly not, right? Right? Because the fact is, if they put on that uniform, they're bastard by definition, and they deserve death by definition, right? Everything becomes very simple. And if you don't have to worry about what world you're trying to build, because obviously the first job is just to destroy this one, right? Well, then that becomes very simple too. And so it is rather a lot like a video game in which there are assumptions at the point you boot up the video game. There are assumptions about the world that you have just stepped into, what tools you have at your disposal, what the limits of your behavior are, right? And the point is it's go, and it's dopamine, 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 and then at the point that you have to put it away, maybe you miss it. And in some sense, we're watching this play out in the streets, and the hard part to understand is not so much why people do it and why they like it. The hard part to understand is why those of us who know that this is not leading somewhere are tolerating it.
This is the question that is hardest to ask, especially as somebody who I identify myself on the left part of the political spectrum, and I have friends, close friends, who just won't talk to me right now. And it's hard. I want to have real conversations about this, but there is something significant about where this is playing out: the Pacific Northwest, the San Francisco Bay Area, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C. And those four regions, there has to be a way to look at that and talk about that and figure it out. And I can't even begin. But one thing, let me say this: when I was in with one of the groups up by you, they were one of the youth groups. They were recording. This is on Discord, which is a video game server. So of course, that's the other thing, is when you're using avatars, this all starts online. Your connections are not your face. Your connection is some comic book character or some graphic novel or some historic, whatever you're identifying with. You're presenting yourself through that avatar when you first hook up with these groups in a lot of cases, certainly at the beginning. And I was there presenting myself. You have to say why you're radical, what you think of Donald Trump, this kind of stuff. And they vet you. And one young woman said, I'm 15, and my dad told me about this group. And I thought, well, there you go. If you have not only cover, so it's not only cover or support, but it's actual approbation from the older generation that you're fighting the good fight, then you're coming in saying, hey, this is my culture. This is who we are. And there are larger cultural questions that are worth addressing, and I am not even remotely qualified to begin talking about. But from what I've seen on the street, that if it's not just young people. Oh, here's a very interesting point that hasn't been talked about. Michael Reinl, who shot and killed Jay Danielson, who's a member of Patriot Prayer, after a MAGA caravan rally And it was this caravan rally in Portland, we all know, that descended into on-the-street skirmishes from LARP, what we have seen and known as LARP scrimmages. There's been very little heavy artillery or firearms. It's just been a bear spray mostly. But on that night, he comes out and he shoots and kills Jay Danielson. His name, Michael Reinl, was being carried on a banner in Sacramento this last weekend. He's been given martyrdom status. Not only that, when the news got back to the Portland protesters, they applauded, they cheered, and they said, I'm not going to, shed a tear here. And they cheered the death. They cheered the killing. The Reinl was older. He wasn't a young man, but he was recently radicalized by Instagram proof. And I looked at his Instagram account and I screenshotted some things, but I was very interested on what his posts looked like. Everything after May 30th was all radical politics. Everything before May 30th was snowboarding, his family, all this other stuff. And you ask, well, is there a life event that's connected? Other people who probably know the personal side. I do not. I'm just saying that in the online presentation of yourself, it's not just young people. It can be somebody of an older generation that latches on and then presents themselves in this social identity as part of this group and a part of this cause. And when you have a social agreement that reaches generations, I think that's significant. And if it's also tied to other structures in your local society, then it becomes a phenomenon. And
all right. So I don't know that I believe this, but I think it's an idea worth wondering about. So and I won't speak for you, but I won't be surprised if you find yourself somewhere similar. I find myself very much of the left because I have a deep sense of what I think might be wrong, what we might do better, what's unfair about the way things are structured. And I don't think it's a small matter. I think our well-being depends on upgrading the system so that it is fairer and so that it's built to tolerate the hazards of the 21st century. But I find that almost all of what I hear discussed on the left is so clearly wrong, backwards looking, unaware of underlying issues like game theory, collective action problems, things like that, although I find myself in the neighborhood of the left because I believe change is necessary, I find myself left cold by almost everything discussed on the left. It's just not high enough quality to constitute a belief system. However, what I'm watching is like a fractal, or maybe it's not like a fractal. It's like I know what the biological word is. It's a cline, but there's a gradation. You've got people on the very front line who are launching ball bearings at police officers with slingshots, right? That's a potentially devastating act. And then you've got people behind them who are ideologically aligned, dressed in black, providing cover, but not actually going to launch a projectile at anyone. And you got people behind them who are, convinced that policing is so dangerous that we'd be better off without it. And the point is, you keep stepping back, and at some point, you're not an anarchist, but you're so frustrated at the genuine problems that you see and their persistence and our unwillingness to look at them and address them that you're willing to donate money to the cause, right? You're willing to bail somebody out because they're willing to launch a ball bearing at a police officer or something like that. And so what I'm trying to understand is how it is that a mayor, my mayor, ends up hamstringing the police such that violent criminals are allowed to direct traffic, they're allowed to wake citizens up from their bed and accuse them of things in their own, self-constructed court in the street. All right, it should be tremendously popular to shut down a movement that is terrorizing citizens. And yet, here in Portland, that's not what we see. We see people not only tolerating this, but we see them actively supporting it. It's true that our mayor beat the Antifa-aligned challenger who faced him, but apparently he beat this challenger because there was a third party in the race, a write-in candidate who robbed the Antifa mayoral candidate of enough votes to return Wheeler to office. So what I'm trying to understand is how it is that people could be so foolish in the face of a violent, destructive movement that does not like them, right? It's willing to wake them up with air horns and sirens, and it's willing to berate them on their own front porch. That should be very unpopular, and yet somehow people expressing their will through the system are supporting this and, keeping it alive. So am I seeing it right?
Yeah, it's continued idealism in a sense that, okay, you mentioned the bail fund. The bail fund's interesting in Portland because there's over $1.3 million. But when you do the math of the contributions, it breaks down to $40 contributions. And this is what people on the right don't understand. And I do have conversations when I cover protests and I talk to people on the right. And I have to, they always bring up George Soros. And you have to kind of explain that these individual donations, who do they come from? And I always say it's people like my folks, it's people who are on the left who are at a point in their life where they see the righteousness in the sense that they see the idealized righteousness. They're not there. They're not on Twitter. It's not being presented to them on CNN. It's not being presented to them on MSNBC. So they don't watch Fox News. So if you have a media diet that supports it, then it makes sense to go along with it. And I still am looking for solutions. And I've not spoken out a lot because I want the conversation I don't want to end up a soundbite on Fox News. I want the conversation to go towards discussing progressive solutions. And I think they want that too. But they don't know what's being carried out because it doesn't make it out of the local market.
So when you say they want that too, you mean the people who are supporting the donors.
Yeah, the liberal donors. They don't see what gets out of Portland and Minneapolis. For example, not only if you're in Northern California, not only do you not know that there was a riot in Sacramento on Saturday, you also don't know that it was coordinated with a riot in St. Paul within hours. Both crowds coordinated and organized to start with the shields, go against MAGA and the Proud Boys, then get pushed back, then destroy all of the cars that had, MAGA, and then claim victory. You don't know that because it wasn't reported. Now Minneapolis, it was reported more than Sacramento. But when it doesn't make it out of those local markets to CNN, and this is where cable news and national news is, I'm a member of the media for 17 years. I always doubted those, especially those from the libertarian right who were telling me that the media, curates the story and so on and so forth. And I said, yeah. And, for 17 years I worked until I was furloughed in May. And you don't understand that, wow, if the connections aren't being put forth in the national conversation, then they just stay locally. They don't get out of DC and connect with Minneapolis and Portland. And I don't know anybody in the national news who's written a story connecting the tactics even that spread virally through the internet essentially since the end of May. Nobody's talking about it. And so if you're one of those donors, you just don't know. You don't know what's going on the street.
I think I figured it out. Believe it or not. Yeah.
We got it?
I think I say it I say it in jest, but I actually do think that there's something really important here and that I finally put two and two together and gotten something real close to 4.
Great.
All right, it's like this. The conscious mind is activated when things don't add up. I'm not going to defend that statement here. I could, but it's a biological phenomenon. And the reason is that consciousness is not a very good way of navigating things that you're familiar with. It's the best tool when you're in uncharted waters. In fact, it's the only tool, right? So, consciousness, I'm going to argue, is inconsistent with consumer behavior, right? And so my point would be an advertising-driven model for news needs to keep you out of your conscious mind, right? You're not going to buy deodorant if you're thinking real hard, right? Or you're not going to be persuaded to switch deodorants or whatever it is they're trying to convince you to do, right? Because that's your unconscious mind that's, persuaded by the pretty model with the nice teeth and the toothpaste or whatever, right? As soon as you're conscious, then you're a whole different animal, and the fact is you're a skeptic. So my point's going to be that these stories, which do exactly what you've described, and I've seen it so many times, and the fact is I became enough of a news story for a while that I watched these stories written about me and events that were central to my life, and so I could detect exactly what was wrong with them, right? I knew where these stories were misleading people, and there was very little to be done about it. But the point is, a publication whose audience is left-leaning and is selling ad space to whoever, not only, even if you would read the story and pay attention to it, right, what the advertisers need you to do is not become conscious. And to the extent that a story that says, that left-wing protesters are behaving in an authoritarian, anti-liberal fashion, right? That doesn't quite add up. And so the point is, in order to keep you out of your conscious mind, to keep you in a buying mood or to keep you compliant, you have to not be challenged. And so it isn't so much that people wouldn't read stories that challenge their belief system, but liberals aren't being told what these people who are nominally on their side are really doing, because it doesn't add up. And to the extent that it not adding up would cause people to say, wait, Black Lives Matter, of course I'm on board with that. Black people have faced terrible things in the U.S. Well, yes, they have. That does not in any way suggest Marxism is the answer, right? So to the extent that you have to be confronted with the fact that something that you believe is traveling with something that you don't believe, right, that would cause you to wake up. And so I'm wondering if what's going on is that the advertising model is causing publications and journalists and every facet of the system to learn the trick of not waking up the audience, right? Telling them what they want to hear so they don't suddenly realize, hey, the world doesn't add up, right? These people say they're on my team, but they're advocating for things I don't like. Anyway, does that resonate for you?
It does. I do want to address one thing first, because I'm not sure of all of the movements that I've talked about, the Boogaloo, all the varieties of anti-fascism and anarchism. The thing I understand the least, to be quite honest, is Black Lives Matter. I do not know where it is. Like, I know that I supported it and still do in principle. I don't know what this organization is and what they're doing. I know that now they've come out and they're lobbying the incoming administration. I do know that. But I've been messaging them since June asking, are you for or against, or do you even know what is happening on the street and that these tactics are being executed? And then when I listen to podcasts of the three women who started it, I try to look for clues, but I'm not quite sure that they're of the same world as that. As far as the conscious, but I do have to also mention the Marxist thing, because when I say I don't know what it is, I'm not sure where the Marxist connection comes in. I do know that there are physical Marxists in Denver who identify as such, and you do have that identification. There is a social authoritarianism of these on the street movements, but I'm not sure about the Marxism thing, because that might, my instinct is that might be another one of these tripping points. But we could get into that later. As far as the consumerism, it's actually my dad who is of this donor generation that supports the causes, much like I do, and he and my mom have been copy editing my work since May, and not without some resistance. This has been really tough. There's been moments where, are you sure that this is where, can this wait? It's the big one. Can this wait?
Right.
Till the election, to the inauguration, can it just wait? That's the big question. But I'm sorry, I was just to say, he said to me one day, we're out on the porch, and he said, he's reading and talking to me, he says, it's this consumerism, it's this mass consumerism. I don't remember when I agreed to it.
Right. We never did. We were transmuted from citizens into consumers, and it's absolutely diabolical, in my opinion.
But the kids know it. The kids know it. And this is where
we all know it. We all know that something is desperately wrong. And so we really ought to be having a very rich conversation about what the fundamental things that are wrong are. It's likely to be small in number and big in effect. But instead, what we do is we all detect that things are off. We know that civilization is making us unhappy. It's making us physically unhealthy. It's making us psychologically unwell. It's making it so we don't know how to interact with each other. And so people are, in some sense, lashing out at the sense that things are just way off, right? And to that extent, I resonate. But to the extent that we are not going to recognize, you don't notice the stuff that works. That's the thing about things that work, right? Is it's pretty seamless, right? You don't notice all the physiological stuff that works, that's modulating your temperature and keeping it just right, the pH of your blood, all of these things. They're seamless to you. You only notice when it goes wrong. And so civilization is humming along. It's putting us in danger. It's doing terrible things to us as individuals, but it is also feeding us in a way that we do not intuit because, the food just shows up at the supermarket, right? It's so reliable you don't think about it. And so the danger that we are being put in by people who see only what's wrong and therefore in a mood just to simply destroy is tremendous. And it would be, some of them are just crazy, right? We can't listen to people who are hell-bent on destruction and would be in any era, no matter how good things were. On the other hand, there are a lot of other people who are correctly registering that things are not working and have fallen in with this ideology that thinks it knows what the solution is, clearly doesn't. I mean, the way in which these claims are wrong is so, it should take an afternoon to explain why it is that anarchism cannot work in the 21st century. Can it work in a group of 30, 40, maybe 100? Sure. But is it going to work at a civilization scale? Of course not. It can't. Collective action problem. End of story. So we need to be having that conversation, and we can't have it because even as we're becoming thinking people, we are being fed by something that wants us in our consumer mindset, and that is it could hardly be more dangerous. I did want to go back to one thing, though. It's very interesting that you don't resonate with the idea that BLM is Marxist, right? This strikes me. So I will say I have certainly encountered anarchists for many years now, going back, to Occupy. So, that era. But I've spent much more time interacting with the Black Lives Matter side of this current movement, which is something of a chimera. As you point out, BLM and Antifa are not inherently the same thing, even though Antifa and anarchism appear to have very deep anti-racist roots, right? But these are two things that have come together. The Marxism, it's one of these things, especially if you grew up as a person on the left, right? You hear people ranting about Marxism, and it feels like suddenly you've been teleported back into the 50s, right? And that people are hiding under their desks worried about, the Ruskies or whatever. But the fact is, when you get into what it is that's going on the BLM side, you find the Marxism is right there. Now, it's a new kind of Marxism. It's racialized Marxism, but it is all about redistribution, right? It's about redistribution on the basis of what is called equity, which the first time you hear equity, you think it has a lot to do with equality. Turns out it's almost the opposite of equality. It is equality of outcome, but at a racial and identity level. And equality of outcome is Marxist. And in fact, one of the founders of BLM is on tape saying that actually she's a trained Marxist. So go ahead.
I looked that up, and I think it's significant who she was talking to, because she was talking to a group of radicals in Baltimore. It's a selective cut. So I've questioned that cut a lot, and I've tried to do as much research as possible. I would love to see the whole thing. But her presenting that idea to other radicals, I thought I didn't have enough evidence, because then I later heard her in conversation with one of the other founders of Black Lives Matter sort of laughing about how they're blanketly called Marxists, because those women are very capitalistic. One of them's on a book tour right now, so there is this disconnect of entrepreneurial, mostly a lot of Black women that I've seen that are involved with the movement are very entrepreneurial and capitalistic, and this idea of Marxism as being an underlying current. What I do see, though, I think I used a different word. I think I made up my own identification for it, which is the social authoritarianism of it, which is that you will, and that's what we see when you're someone like me who's out there on the street, is you're told to fall in line after they bash the cars up. They say, the chant is, "What did you see? I didn't see shit. What did you see? I didn't see shit." And that idea that you're going to come in and you're buying in, or you're, or not. That's what I said is social authoritarianism. But I don't know that the young kids or the people who are out there would even, there are plenty on the internet who laud Karl Marx, and you can see that all over leftist Twitter. But I don't even know that the people who are on Twitter sitting at home are the same as the ones who are actively out in the street. And so that's why I gravitate away from Marxism as a label. And it may be my own bias because I've heard it so much as a right-wing talking point.
As a right-wing talking point, sure. Yeah. But what I'm trying to convey to you is actually, I don't care one way or the other what label we use. And Marxism, as I hear myself say it, I do feel like, how on earth did I end up, in 2020 talking about the hazard of Marxism in America? On the other hand, I lived this close up, and this equity stuff is about equality of outcome. But in order to define equality of outcome, so equality of outcome is a preposterous and dangerous idea in and of itself, and it is Marxist.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right.
Yes.
And
I agree.
In this case, you've got a kind of novel twist, which is that whose well-being are we equalizing, right? Oh, the races, right? And so this intersectional stuff is very academic. It has a kind of kernel of truth at its inception, and then a lot of nonsense stacked on top of it over decades of work. Critical theory in all of its forms, same way, right? There's a kernel of truth and then a whole lot of nonsense, and then somehow it breaks into the mainstream at the point Donald Trump is elected, the George Floyd protests. This brings the anarchists in contact with these, let's call them functional Marxists. They don't necessarily have to resonate with Marx at all. But the point is what they're advocating, even if they invented it themselves, what they are advocating is equality of outcome, which requires massive redistribution. And so let's find a new term, but let's not fail to recognize that what we've learned about Marxism and the reasons that it doesn't work and the fact that it doesn't work, those lessons apply here. And to the extent that we need to have a conversation in which the huge majority of people who resonate with Black Lives Matter, right, including me, I resonate with the slogan. I believe blacks have had a raw deal, and I believe it is time that we do something. In fact, it is overdue. However, if you sign up for the banner that says Black Lives Matter because you know that there's a problem for black people in the US and that it needs a solution, right? And then you end up through the back door ending up with all of this Marxist redistributional stuff that's game theoretically unstable and a lethal hazard to the competitiveness of any organization that picks it up or any nation that embraces it, right? We're talking about a belief system that is what will kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, when the real question is, are the eggs distributed fairly, right? So that's where we are, and we need to have that question. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that these two things came together. And if you arrived at this discussion through the Black Lives Matter critical theory intersectionality route, if that was what caught your attention, then the anti-fascism, anarchism, black bloc thing is a bit of a mystery to you, right? You don't understand where it came from, what it is. But if you arrived through that door, then BLM is a bit of a paradox, right? BLM seems like a totally rational concept, but the deeper you dig, it's like attacking the nuclear family and all sorts of other stuff that you wouldn't expect would be on the minds of people trying to, solve a problem with racial fairness.
Well, and again, I mean, I don't know the nuclear family. I've heard that talking, but I don't understand that, to be quite honest. Where does that come from, though? Because again, when I say I don't understand Black Lives Matter, I'm saying that the leadership has been, in my personal opinion, absent in that they haven't been connected to what's going on in this street. And so in that absence of active leadership in the anarchism of the social justice movement, you have all these other things that come into place or fill that void. But I don't know. I don't know what you think in respect to that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to tell you what I know. One thing I can tell you is that it was true early on that when people were, rah, rah, Black Lives Matter, and I would say to them, look, I'm for the idea. Black lives are undervalued. That's what that idea means to me, and I agree. Black lives are undervalued in the U.S., and that needs to be fixed. However, if you go to the website of the organization, you will find that in signing up for Black Lives Matter, you're signing up to take a position against the state of Israel. You're signing up to fight against the nuclear family. So all of these things were on their website.
The website?
I believe they've been removed because I think they took a lot of heat. But it's not like they were repudiated. They just were removed because it was inconvenient. So anyway, you might have to go to the Wayback Machine or something like that to find them. But here's why the nuclear family even comes up here, I suspect. One, there is a problem in the black community with, and people should not jump out of their seats. There's a problem with too many people being raised by a single parent, in general, their mother, right? This is a hazard because human beings are very expensive and difficult to raise. So a two-parent household, this is a construction of evolution that allows the labor of raising a child to be distributed. And the fact is, unless you're very, very wealthy, raising a child alone is not an easy thing to do, right? So anyway, why is this happening in Black America with such regularity? Well, I would argue it has a lot to do with the fact that opportunity is not evenly distributed. It is lacking in the black community. This results in a great deal more crime than would otherwise be committed by blacks, which results in a lot of incarceration, which means that there's an imbalance between the number of men in the community and the number of women. And what that does is it undermines it undermines their bargaining position in forming pair bonds, right? That is to say, because men are men, because men can reproduce without committing to anyone, men are wired to look for sexual opportunity that does not require commitment. Now, when you have too few men in a community, because there's not enough opportunity and because men have been incarcerated in large numbers, what that means is that the men who are not incarcerated are in very high demand. And because they're in very high demand, they end up having lots of choice, and women are in competition with each other, very intensely so, for the attention of men. And so it's very hard to get men to commit to a single partner when there are always lots of options for them. So in my opinion, that is the root of the single parenthood crisis that exists in Black America. The problem, though, is that white society never tires of portraying Black culture as defective, and that being the root cause of single parenthood. And so there's a sensitivity amongst Blacks about single parenthood and a desire to defend it. And so here's where the answer to your question comes. If you imagine that there's something marvelous about the nuclear family, about a pair of parents raising offspring, then this situation where you have a lot of single parenthood in the Black community looks problematic. But if you don't have a choice, then it's the only mechanism, or it's the common mechanism to produce offspring. So there's a temptation to regard the nuclear family, which, by the way, is an invention. The nuclear family is not some ancient structure. It used to be that two parents would end up raising children, but they would be embedded in a larger kin group, right? You would have, you'd be raising children in the same family, in the same village where you were born. Your family would be around you. There were a lot of people to take some of the burden from parenthood. Mm-hmm. So in any case, in some sense, there is reason to attack the nuclear family as an invention, because it is an invention, right? The idea that people would move into some different city, they would partner up with one other person, they would raise children together. That's a broken system compared to a larger kin group that raises children. But that is not the same thing as an attack on the nuclear family. In other words, the pair bond is key to raising children well, right? That pair bond would be better off if it were embedded in a larger family, but it is still better than a single parent with respect to being able to distribute the burden of raising children. So, in essence, what has happened is because there is a sex ratio problem in the Black community, there is a single parent problem, which plays a role in dysfunction. And Black Lives Matter has attacked the nuclear family in some sense as a mechanism for equalizing the playing field. In other words, if there's something broken about the nuclear family, and the problem isn't single parents, the problem is that people are pairing off in other communities, then that attack, in theory, is an equalizing force. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. I wonder, it has me thinking about all these alternative structures that I hear just being around it. I haven't delved into the ideas of, of communal living. They talk a lot about mutual aid, about, who keeps us safe, we keep us safe. The social bonding in these protests is significant. I go back to Sacramento again, because this is another example. When they beat up the couple, one of the surprising events was then their own medics came in to tend to the couple that was just beaten. So you had your own criminal action, then you had your own medics come in, you had your own press deciding how to cover it favorably, and then you had your own security with umbrellas policing how things move along, you didn't see shit, that kind of thing. And so the idea that this new social bonding replaces whatever traditional ideas we would otherwise gravitate towards. I guess I see it discussed philosophically, but I don't know if I would attach that just to one organization like BLM, for example, because you have so many organizations. So Sacramento Antifa on their blog said, we had 25 organizations out this last weekend that came together. That's in one action of 1,000+ people on the streets of Sacramento. So, the number of different small groups that are at work that are networked is really quite astounding. I wonder, as I think of solutions, because from the beginning, I have always been insistent that I'm not trying to capitalize on my work. I'm trying to think of these ideas that you mentioned, the equality of outcome, equality of opportunity. I see as the antidote that is missing, and I look at the opportunities that my parents' generation have, and it's very clear. Part of my family hails from the Japanese American community, to a point where some of them were born in internment camps. So that community had everything taken away from them. Their land was even sold. They could go into the camps by the oppression of this government with only what they could carry. But when they came out, a lot of them went to the East Coast. When they got back to the West Coast, they faced prejudice. There was still equality of opportunity for that generation in their experience. I want to just say, in their experience. I have to qualify that. So much so that, my aunt, for example, when she had, there were reparations made to the Japanese. They got them in the 90s. By that time, a lot of them own their own houses already. And that's because going to college, going to the UC system, like my parents did, like my aunt did, you didn't come out of it with overwhelming student debt, and you could own your own house. And there was a pathway to home ownership. So I keep thinking of equality of opportunity and a progressive capitalism that doesn't rely on redistribution, but of subsidizing, for example, down payments for home ownership. There are small programs in Denver and Los Angeles. And these are the kind of opportunities that we need to fight for as a nation, like we're fighting a war. Because what we're seeing didn't come out of the middle of nowhere. Just 2 years ago, my dad was up in the Bay Area. He was involved with the lecture series talking about the work of Piketty from Europe, an economist. And they were talking about, I remember one of the speakers saying, when the rich get rich, the poor get poorer. And that opportunity to enter the middle class gets more and more narrow. Well, what do the people down here do? And his words were eerie. He said, they don't just sit there and seethe. They never have historically. And so the idea that equality of opportunity can somehow get us out of this mess is at the forefront of my mind. And I hope beyond the echo chambers and the polarization, because what we're also dealing with is a profit model that in our media that runs off of our polarization. And if we are just seeing that and we have those blinders on, we can't see where we agree. For example, when I tweet about or post about equality of opportunity and that my parents' generation had a much easier way into home ownership and building wealth, and then therefore having that wealth to pass on to future generations. When I talk about that, conservatives like it just as much as progressives do. So there are these meeting places, but if we don't understand that everything that we're seeing I don't even use the term far left anymore, because they're right here. They're right next to us. And they're right next to us because we are them. We're the ones who are giving cover when we don't talk about it. We're the ones who are supporting tacitly or otherwise by buying into these other ideas of struggle without actually participating, but clicking this like or that. We are here on the left seeing identical, mirrored, quote unquote, extremism to the right. People are they are disenfranchised. They don't trust the institutions, whether it be government or media, and they are looking for something else. And that's why a third party, and I came upon your work looking at your unity push. There might be opportunity here in this disintegration and this sort of cataclysmic year that we've had, there might be opportunity in which people that we traditionally think of as our political adversaries on the right and the left aren't as different as we think, and that the most passionate have gravitated towards these poles. And we have to figure out when we let our passion eclipse our reason. Because if there's one theme that I've seen since, all year long, whether it was on the right or the left, if passions eclipse our ability to discuss about these matters reasonably, we won't even notice where we agree, because it'll never even be brought up. We won't even have a chance to talk about it.
So you're absolutely right about this. And I've spent a lot of time, the irony of the way I was forced out of my college put me in contact with a tremendous number and variety of people on the right. Okay, so I've been on the far left my whole life, but many of the people that I interact with, I would argue, are center right, and some of them just simply right. But what I've learned is that, in fact, in 2020, most of the people, in fact, all of the reasonable people, agree on the basics, right? They agree on the principles that are the core of our society. They agree that it is desirable to have opportunity distributed as broadly as possible. They are not interested in seeing one race triumph over another. These are broadly held American values. They weren't always, but they are now. Yeah. And we don't recognize this because, as you point out, we are being induced into a kind of polarization that makes other people unhearable to us. The problem is, so I take your example of the internment camps for Japanese Americans very seriously. And in fact, I'll tell you that my grandparents had a set of planters in their house. And the story behind the planters was that a Japanese man had given them the planters to take care of them as he went to the camp. I think he went to Manzanar. And he was going to return for them afterwards, and he never came back. Presumably he did not survive his incarceration there, if that's even the right term. I'm not sure. But internment, yeah.
But it's all euphemistic,
right? In any case, that story is important to me because my grandparents were certainly understood to be egalitarians who knew that what was happening to their Japanese American friends and family was unconscionable. There was nothing they could do about it. But in any case, the fact is, leaving the camps with very little was certainly a disadvantage, but it was not something that couldn't be overcome given the amount of opportunity that existed, right? If you had the ability to access the market, there was opportunity, even though there was racism against Japanese people. And in fact, it was very intense at that point because of what had happened during the war. But what I think we need to understand is that for people on the right, they tend to see the fact that we all technically have equal access to the market as equal opportunity. And to an extent, it's true. You can overcome a substantial disadvantage, even in the form of racial injustice, if you know how to access the market. And so for Japanese Americans after the war, for members of the Jewish diaspora like me, yes, it's enough. It doesn't have to be, the access doesn't have to be perfectly equal. The tools don't have to be perfectly equal. It's enough. But for two populations, there has been a persistent problem. In other words, there are features of the environment in which opportunity is imagined to exist that don't function. And so I would argue that for Black Americans and for Native Americans, there has been a problem. And it is very hard to diagnose exactly how it functions. And it's certainly true that there are many successful people in both of those communities, but there is also a problem, a persistent problem that results in stagnation, economic stagnation, and an inability to access opportunity. So in some sense, I think the conversation that we ought to be having is, utopianism is dangerous. Even if you agree that equality of opportunity is the goal, you're never going to perfectly achieve it, right? And anybody who thinks that a system that doesn't perfectly achieve it has to be torn down is actually putting us in danger. We need to achieve it well enough that people have sufficient tools that they can work their way into a better life. For populations for whom that hasn't worked, we have to ask the question, what happened? Why? And I would argue that in the case of Black Americans and Indian Americans, that we're dealing with two very unique origin stories, right? Unique origin stories that have disrupted the cultural tools that would allow access. And we've also had a different kind of racism in both cases. So there is something to be discussed. And to the extent that I think a lot of us intuit that, we are tempted to embrace anything that seems to be demanding improvement. But the problem is when when Black Lives Matter is demanding improvement in the form of abolishing police, and as dangerous as many American neighborhoods are, there's no neighborhood in the U.S. that's so made so dangerous by the police that eliminating it is going to make them better. Even when policing is biased, what you don't see is all the crime that is prevented because people know that if they commit crime, bad things will happen to them. So we have to figure out how to address the question of where is opportunity not reaching, what are the mechanisms that prevent it from reaching, and what might actually help, right? How can we actually democratize opportunity so it is as broadly distributed as possible? Because unless you're a corrupt son of a bitch, right? Even if you're a diehard capitalist who believes that the market is the solution to everything, there is no argument that the market works better when access to it is narrowed, right? If you're a libertarian capitalist, then you want opportunity as broadly distributed as possible. And that's the question. How broadly distributed is opportunity? And the places that it doesn't reach, how do we get it there?
Well, that would be Ferguson. From where I was in the last 6 months. I mean, the Ferguson connection to 2014 is very apparent in the sense that not only did movements come together, Ferguson is where you had Black Lives Matter mobilize, and folks took buses to Ferguson, and anarchists also. I gotta qualify it. Not radicals across the spectrum, but also insurrectionists who used Black Bloc techniques were there as well and have documented it. So it's all out there on the internet. But I went to Ferguson this summer and I walked around and it was an interesting choice to go because I wasn't going there because it was activated. I was going there to see what it was abstract in my mind. I didn't know what Ferguson looked like. I know what Los Angeles looks like. I know what San Francisco looks like, but I didn't know what Ferguson was. And so when the first place I found was the liquor store, and I went and talked to people outside and inside the liquor store and walked around. And there's no memorials in Ferguson. It's an inner city neighborhood that. When you go from business to business, none of the businesses are Black owned. And the community is nearly entirely Black that I saw and that I spoke with, certainly. From business to business, from the liquor store, of course, the Chinese food joint, the cell phone store, the Black beauty supply store. And you would think, and I started researching the Black beauty industry, and you would think that there'd be opportunity there in the sense that, I read that the market share of Black-owned businesses in the Black beauty industry is somewhere between 6 and 10%, and that everything on the exterior said to me, this place must be Black-owned, and it wasn't. And so when it comes to business opportunity and home ownership and wealth and all those educational programs, when it comes to financial literacy And, I as a privileged kid, I couldn't figure out how to get a credit card when I was 22. And I could because I'd finished college and I didn't have a job. And they said, well, you're not in college anymore, so we can't give you a credit card. And I said, what? And they said, well, you're unemployed. You're looking for a job and you're not in college anymore, so we can't give you a credit card. We could have given it to you when you were in college. And that stuck with me in the sense that, well, okay, if there are all these arbitrary obstacles and then some that aren't, and then if you're in a community that's isolated from opportunity, I have to imagine that it's even more difficult. And so the question becomes, the Ferguson that I saw and walked through, once I walked around and talked to people, it reminded me of other inner cities all across the country. So opportunity as a whole, how can we increase that so that people have opportunity to own businesses in the communities which they live? Because pride of ownership then extends not only to your home, but to the businesses, your surrounding, your neighborhood, everything. And again, this is where I don't use radicalism as a bad word. We have to radically restore the opportunity that was available for past generations. And the only way to do that is education and at least coming up with programs that are social programs that help subsidize and promote these growth and opportunity. And I don't know, I'd be interested, I'm supposed to talk to somebody who's familiar with the opportunity zones under the outgoing administration and how that has played out. And I'd be very curious because those were census tracts that were identified, not by race, but by economics and so forth. And I'd be very interested to see what has been going on and promoted as far as urban development in the last 4 years. I'd be curious what the current status of those programs are and how they could be built upon. And perhaps there could be some sort of consensus on what we need to do to restore that opportunity for this generation and future generation.
Yes, I'd be very interested to see that conversation happen, and I'd be especially keen on it if it included some voices from the right. I'm thinking in particular of Bob Woodson and John Wood Jr., both of whom are friends of mine, and they have compelled me that the traditional view of the hazards to Black America are misunderstood on the left. At first, I didn't know what they were telling me, but over many conversations, I've learned quite a bit, and there's a lot to be said, I would say, for figuring out. There's a traditional divide between the focus on the right, on personal responsibility, and the focus on the left of collective responsibility. And it seems to me that there is a very natural interplay between these things that we never spell out because of the polarization, which is that civilization has an obligation to make things functional so that your personal responsibility is sufficient, right? So it is your responsibility to make use of the opportunity that you have, but it is our collective responsibility to make sure that you have that opportunity and that those two things have to travel together. And I think it is exactly the right moment to be having that conversation. In fact, it's overdue. But I do think if we can get past, fighting each other in the street over cartoon visions of the future, that this is the place that we have to go.
I think even those people that are in the street don't really understand how close they are to each other. I have a new podcast that I'm doing called Unblocked, and it has a double meaning, obviously, but one of them is we got to stop blocking each other. We got to start listening to each other. So I'm interviewing one activist from the left and then one activist from the right, and that's how I'm starting it out, is just alternating between it. We could go up the chain in different or along the chain rather, as to different social stratospheres where people on one side of the political spectrum and the other actually agree, I think it would be fascinating. Because as I said, the one organizer that I've spoken to who considers himself Antifa, when I talked to him, he even said, "A pox on both our houses," then, which of course is a reference to Shakespeare, and that they're trapped since 2016, Antifa and the Proud Boys, in this sort of the cycle of violence. And nobody talks about how violence is cyclical. In the anarchist movement, they talk about diversity of tactics and the violence is not immoral. But did you think to maybe consider that it's cyclical and that it's hard to get off that train once this group is fighting with this group openly on the streets of Portland and Sacramento, that you might get caught up in it and you might not realize how your opponent and yourself might agree on certain things. They're both against the drug war, They're both against. I remember talking and being really surprised by how anti-authoritarian they both say they want to be, and on how many points of possibility there are. But when you're too busy bear macing each other and hitting each other with shields because you think the other represents something that the propaganda has told you, because the propagandizing is just constant, and they just stay at each other's throats, and they're not alone. To say that it's just the LARPers in the street is wrong. It's us on our social media every day taking sides and pointing the finger at that person and at that extreme example that we would never be.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, in fact, I'm always pointing out this report that emerged, the Hidden Tribes Report, which reveals that there's something like 67% of us in the middle that agree on the basics, and that, we're not extreme on most issues, right? And this exactly mirrors my experience traveling between the left and the right and talking to people. And my feeling is it's actually very simple. In general, except for the fringes, we agree on almost everything with respect to values. What we disagree on is how close we are to a fair society and what the ordering of the priorities are. In other words, we agree on what the priorities are, but we don't agree on whether, justice is more important or liberty, for example, right? But we agree that they're on the list, and it's just a question of which one is the top value. And we do have real disagreements. Many people look at the U.S., for example, and they say, well, I faced disadvantage. I did fine. I know lots of people like that. It's fair. And if you're unable to get out of poverty, for example, that's on you because the opportunity is clearly there. And then others regard the problems as extremely pernicious and structural. And, that's a hard conversation to have, but it's a lot easier than imagining that the person on the other side of that discussion is, inherently a racist, right? Or inherently a fascist or any of these things. So, yes, if we can get out of the narrative that we have been talked into and into a discussion about, all right, where actually are we? How much have we achieved? How much remains to be achieved? And, what is the safest and best route there? The opportunity for us to do better and to solve the problems that are real is spectacular. Though I worry we won't do it because we're all sucked into this narrative in which the boogeyman is right around the corner.
Yeah, I think if we have to look at some of the forces that are propagating that idea, though. And that's why I've been out on the streets and not shying away, even online, to the attacks. Because, like you, when New York Times piece came out, there was an organized, a couple of groups. One of them was a radical Bay Area group that has a very high profile publication. They also have a radio show. And then another group was really a global anarchist publication. And even like the Trotskyists in Michigan came out, and there's one more. Well, the Minneapolis group that is very labor oriented. The IWW and the Wobblies also have a very pro-radical insurrectionist identification in some sense in some places like Minneapolis. So I had a couple of Wobblies contact me personally and say, you're messing things up and this and that. And some of them were polite, some of them weren't. But it all sprung up because, first of all, you're not allowed to talk to this. It's a little protectionist in the sense that if you're in high school and you really like this band and that's your subculture and you identify with that, and then some like normie tries to talk about it, it's fucking outrageous, and you're gonna erupt. Right, justly, you're going to erupt and do everything you can to point out how unqualified this person is to talk about this or even think about it. But so a lot of that uprising, that internet uprising, when you try to have these conversations, it has a pattern to it. And what I noticed was these publications talked about me and made a whole list and threads of false assertions and character assassination, because I had reached out to try to interview. This is around September 26th, after the Michael Reinl and Jay Danielson, after both of them died in these conflicts and so forth. There was this big Proud Boys rally, and I think there was even a state of emergency that was declared. I was there. I went to both rallies, dressed different for each, of course, but that I had interviewed and reached out to interview the chairman of the Proud Boys was, it was just blasted everywhere. And then it was this, and that I had retweeted something that Tim Pool said, but it was Tim Pool was saying that the president should have said, "Fuck all white supremacists," and I thought that was a funny thing, and I was like, I retweeted it. And they're like, he retweeted Tim Pool. He's all right. And they just came after me. It was a rabid crowd. And I said, well, but first of all, I don't follow this guy that much anyway. But that he was saying, fuck all white supremacists. And I can't.
Oh, it makes no sense.
There's no logic. There's no logic to the attacks, but they will dig. And this is what I was surprised by. They dug really deep, because I used to do comedy under my nickname is Kenji, and I was part of the New York comedy scene. But they found all this stuff from another part of my life and tried to screenshot one sketch to make it look like it was racist, even though it wasn't. Even though all my work was progressive from that time, I had to actually fight the alt-right and neo-Nazis who came after a video that I did that was on The View. It was socially progressive. Whoopi Goldberg introduced it. And it was a parody of this Cheerios commercial, which got attacked. These alt-right trolls attacked it because it had a biracial couple. The young girl pours Cheerios on her dad. They say it's heart healthy, and she pours the Cheerios on her dad's heart, and he's black. And the mother is white, and the alt-right just went bananas. This was several years ago. I don't even think they were called the alt-right then, but they were these neo-Nazis that came out of nowhere, and they were bashing me. And so I was used to dealing with it, or I'd been through the ringer with the right coming after me, because our version of it was a friend of mine who's a comic, who's a black woman, who was on the couch at the end, and so that it was a lesbian couple infuriated them even more. And she turns to the camera and says, "Eat it, haters," or that happens at the end. And the Huffington Post loved it and wrote about it. So I'm used to being on the progressive social side of this, and then having the right come after me. And it was very strange for the tables to be turned and for people to be trying to paint me as alt-right, because what happens is they issue the attack, maybe at night, they come at night. And if you're not looking at your Twitter, well, you've been blocked. So you can't see the initial post that's been made defaming you, because they make the post defaming you and they block you. So all these people are talking about you that you don't know. Then you wake up the next morning and look at your name, if you know you're narcissistic enough to do so, and you see that it's gone from you were being talked about as alt-right in the original article, then you're a white supremacist. All of a sudden, by the morning, you're a neo-Nazi, and someone's calling me a neo-Nazi, and I'm looking at this going, and the New York Times reporter was she's like, I've never seen anything like this, and she was extremely nervous about how it was going, because they were calling for her to be fired and this and that, and you don't know what you're talking about. And it's all based on hysteria and harnessing hysteria and being able to direct that harnessed hysteria at a certain person. And if you don't engage, I think it gets worse.
Yeah. Well, they're doing what I would call driving your costs. And so the idea is, if you can punish somebody, it doesn't matter that the accusations make no sense, right? If you can drive them crazy, if you can cause other people to assume there must be something, I mean, okay, they're calling you a neo-Nazi. Maybe you're not really a neo-Nazi, but surely there's something wrong with you, right? If that's the accusation, then, clearly you're something. If they can make life hell on the reporter who would dare report the story, then the point is the stories don't exist. The next story that would be written doesn't get written. The next person who would say what they know doesn't show up. And so what it does is it creates this false appearance of consensus, because the only voices are those that are sticking to the narrative. And anytime you look for somebody who tries to explain what doesn't add up about the narrative, what you find is accusations that you have no way of evaluating, right? Like Tim Pool is of the alt-right. Are you fucking kidding me? Right? That's a bizarre accusation. Anyway, part of what's going on is that the narrative is artificially clean, because anybody who strays from it is punished, to the extent that what we find is just, no variation in belief.
It's a flex too, because it doesn't go unnoticed. These publications. So this is my challenge. If you're the Daily Beast and you're the Huffington Post, if you're the Daily Beast and you printed back in 2017 that Antifa is problematic, if you're the Washington Post, what are you afraid of? Why aren't you covering these stories from a journalistic point of view of just what's happening on the street? Does that flex scare you so much that you're going to be thrown to the wolves?
Well,
I don't understand.
The problem is, the Washington Post seems like a thing, but it's made up of people, right? And those people have jobs and they have families to feed, and they don't want to have to find health insurance on their own and all of these things. And so the very fact that if you show independence of thought, you may have thousands of emails arrive at your boss, telling them that you've misbehaved, or that, 10 years ago you said something that was suspect in one way or another. The problem is that hassle, the fact that your boss may be concerned they will come after them next and may decide to fire you because they don't know how to defend you, means that, in effect, these institutions get captured by perspectives that are willing to invest in a punishment. And when we look at the Washington Post and we say, well, you're a newspaper, surely you're interested in reporting the news, and the answer is they are a complex phenomenon that has all kinds of influences, and the news is what they say they're about, but how it functions on the inside is quite different.
Well, I've been pitching to a lot of these organizations since June. As a journalist, it's just something you do. And then I died off for a while because there was a point I realized, okay, this story is way bigger than what I know back in June, for sure. But after 6 months of really staying on it 7 days a week, I think I have a better idea. especially being on the streets. But the question is, how do you get the people who are in these institutions to appreciate or understand that what they're printing is divorced from what's on the street? And it does have to be from the left. I've gotten offers from the right, to publish or to appear and this kind of thing. But we do need to talk to our ideological sort of herd, as it were, and address. So I think it does have to be somebody like the Huffington Post that does write seriously about ethno-nationalists. Well, if you're serious about ethno-nationalists and you've published something that's so serious about ethno-nationalists that some of the Antifa groups are even retweeting it, then you must be serious enough to make distinctions, right? I mean, technically, you should be able to make a distinction between the ethno-nationalists and MAGA normie folks that are getting, they're getting punched out, and the Proud Boys, which is another level of MAGA, but not the ethno-nationalists. So
well, I'd love to see that work. I have my doubts because all of the left-leaning publications seem particularly prone to having narrative enforced on them. And I agree with you that there has to be those of us on the left who are reasonable and are not buying this nonsense have to find our voice. So in some sense, it's odd, but right-leaning publications have been welcoming of left of center authors to describe this. And the problem is, if it's published in the Wall Street Journal, or something like that, it is very easily dismissed, right? Because it's imagined to be right of center, and then you, having written for them, are imagined to be right of center. But the key is, again, this vast group in the middle that agrees on the basics, right? We have to stop thinking of each other as, oh, that's on the left, I'm going to discount it, or that's on the right, I'm not going to believe it. And we have to recognize that conversation, even those of us who come from one side or the other, we have to meet in the middle and have that conversation. And the question about what venues will allow it is, unfortunately, one with not a lot of answers. Most venues are afraid of one constituency or another.
Yeah, and I just don't know where this goes, because already we're able to curate what we want in our news too easily. We're not challenged at all. But even on personal connections, if people on Facebook, for example, even in a closed group of 500 friends or what have you, if they don't feel like conversations can happen, well, then what? When one group goes through an exodus and says, well, we're going to go to this other platform, well, how's that going to help us?
Right.
How are we going to get anywhere? Then we're going to have echo chambers that are so narrow and consensual that we're going to start losing touch even more. My life, some of the important changes in my life this year, going to Ferguson was eye-opening, but also going to Tulsa was. Tulsa, I thought I was going to find white supremacists. I came into this story when I witnessed actions, and we haven't talked about it much, but in Santa Monica that were coordinated in Los Angeles, and we forgot to talk about the videos and stuff that I had sent, but the patterns and the tactics that were being used, as I pursued them, I did realize that, yes, there's genuinely stuff happening on the left, and I recognize techniques, and there's a very explicit video from Los Angeles of a police car being torched. And I'll put that up on publicreport.org/video. I'll have a couple of these videos, and in that you see the Black Bloc practitioners working as a team with skateboards to bust out the windows, pour in lighter fluid, and it's a black guy that realizes this, and he comes home and he's like, "Oh my God, this stuff was he says staged, but I think he means coordinated. It was all coordinated." In other words, staged, not to apply that it was, some sort of
It's not phony, but it was planned.
Yeah, it's not phony, but it was planned. Exactly. And you see that they're doing Black Bloc. This is on May the 30th in Los Angeles in front of CBS Studios on Fairfax Avenue. in the torching of the police cars. And I actually, a friend of mine, a photo came across my feed where I saw my friend standing on that police car burn out. And I thought, wait a second, that doesn't compute. And it's just because I know that friend and I know he didn't burn it. So it did become, after the fact, after it was coordinated, it became a staged event in the sense that you could stand on the police car with your fist up and get a picture, and then it would enter your social media feed. So all this stuff played out in a viral fashion along the one term that was used in a Rutgers study was virally enhanced mobs. That through hashtags that became trending on Twitter, certain techniques could be shared from organization to organization. And that's why we had so much symmetry, much like we just had last week between St. Paul and Sacramento. That has been going on month after month after month without much light being shined on it, because nobody's even willing to really have a conversation about it. And Washington, D.C. is going to be interesting, not just on December 12th, but on Inauguration Day, because Inauguration Day is the traditional anarchist protest day, where anarchists always protest. I think they didn't Obama's first year, but nationwide, the anarchists have always, I don't know how much I should be advocating that, but I'm just saying that it doesn't end there. There's always a new date. Whether it's Thanksgiving and you're tearing down George Washington in Portland and Minneapolis at the same time, there's always going to be another date or excuse for this mob mobilization until we address the ailments in a sufficient radical enough way of our society to make some serious changes. I think that's their point, and they certainly haven't been shy about making.
Well, I disagree with you a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't think that there is anything that we could do that would satisfy the hardcore anarchists. And I realize, I don't want to paint them all with one brush, but I believe that the demands are so preposterous that, effectively civilization would have to fall in order for them to recognize that they were incorrect.
Right. Abolish all police, abolish all prisons, total abolition is the slogan of that you're referring to.
Right. Yeah, it is. And the point is they actually believe it, and it's actually crazy, and we can't afford to test it out. But what that means is that we are, in effect, stuck with this movement behaving in this way until we learn how to say no to it. And I think that's really, from my perspective, that's the key insight, right? That, in effect, you can't bend over backwards far enough as a mayor or a police chief in order to satisfy this movement. And in light of that, that means you're going to pay the price of cracking down on them at some point, and you're either going to do it before they've done a tremendous amount of damage or after. And so as much as, I don't love seeing a police crackdown, but if people are violating the law and demonizing other citizens and, waking them up in the middle of the night and harassing and intimidating and threatening and harming, then they have to be dealt with. That's just simply the nature of the societal agreement that we share.
Yeah, and the societal agreement extends beyond law enforcement. I'm thinking, in one theme that's come back is the consensus gives it cover. There's a reason that Portland, the Bay Area, and Minneapolis, if there's enough consensus in the mainstream to give it cover, then it will keep going. It will keep happening. If you're not even talking about it, or you're too afraid to talk about it or publish conversations because of the repercussions that you imagine to be out there, then that's cover. It means that the bullying is working. It means that the suppression, the umbrella is in our face. The umbrella is in all of our face in some of these cities as it continues week after week, Saturday after Saturday. And in some cities like yours, they don't just pick one day.
No, it's every day.
It's every day. Everyday anti-fascist is one of the slogans that you'll see in Portland, printed up, out and about. And I'm glad that we're talking about it. Of course I'm nervous, more nervous in the sense that you have energy coming at you from all directions, and if your friends tell you not to say anything, that's equally as worrisome as if your enemies tell you not to say anything.
Yeah, it's
or perceived enemies, I should say.
No, unfortunately, I think there's a lot to fear, and I think it is important that we not give into that fear, because the danger of us not discussing it is so profound. It is a small movement, but it is powerful by virtue of the way that it intimidates and stigmatizes. So we have to talk about it. The danger is real. I'm not happy about it. I'm sure you're not happy about it. But, your courage is an important part of this story.
Well, I think that from the beginning, I've wanted to engage as well. And I've tried to have conversations, real conversations, because just like you said, if a publication is made up of individuals and so forth, well, so are each of these little organizations. They're all individual people who have friends of different parts of the social stratosphere, I would think. And so if we talk about it as a society, you get enough critical mass conversation going that it doesn't become so addictive and subversive. If you shine a light on something and have a discussion about it, an honest discussion, then the lie doesn't get to win. And right now the lie is winning. And I've felt that for a long time, that if we talk and discuss and engage each other in good faith, that will open the door to possibility. Because what is so transparent is that those who want to control the conversation won't engage in good faith. They'll only hit you with ad hominem attacks on your character and made up, well, don't talk to this person because he talked to that person. Or that person is a known person to have associated with that person who associates with that person. The logic is infinitely frustrated and transparently sort of
flexible. It's inconsistent, and it is unendingly punitive.
And they know it exactly. It's unendingly punitive. And who can really live in that environment when the next person to be Robespierre could be you?
Yep. Well, let me just say, I would be open to having this conversation with you and one or more members of the insurrectionist anarchists, or Antifa, or both. And that might be worth doing. There might be some real value in having these perspectives meet on one screen.
Yeah, that actually would be interesting. I had reached out to both sides in a similar sort of vein. I had been talking to, and was blasted for, talking to Antifa and the Proud Boys at the same time to try to get them to talk, which was that's a tall order. I mean, because once one of them talks to another, then it always has to be somebody that has enough armor. It's almost why I said the Huffington Post should just walk in and cover this stuff. They have enough armor. They've done enough on white ethno-nationalists. Nobody's going to believe them that the Huffington Post is white supremacist. You know what I mean? So that's why I keep saying, you guys, this is something you can do. You can help bring conversation and discussion about what's going on. But equally as important is, I think that what I would provide is that's tricky with the Antifa and anarchists. They only go to their trusted sources, to those that don't push them. And if they are somebody who's going to do that, they're going to get pushback. They're going to get blasted.
Oh, they will be punished from within.
They will be punished from within. So it really is up to them, in the sense that, and I thought it was going to be after the election. I thought, well, the election's going to happen, and there will be this moment where these movements will, once you don't have Trump, then your enemy is gone. And then what? Are you going to mount an insurrection against Joe Biden?
Yes, they will.
They will, but it's not going to get the same public
No, it will.
cover and animus.
The public will suddenly understand what it doesn't understand now, which was that Trump was a marvelous excuse, right? That Trump played the cartoon villain very effectively, and that took a movement that already existed and gave it a narrative that sort of loosely added up to John Q. Public. But this wasn't about Trump. I think I've heard plenty from inside these movements that they hate Biden equally as much, and that they intend to continue. And so all of those who thought, okay, in part we have to elect Joe Biden in order to, to put an end to these violent movements in the street, they were suckered.
Yeah, well, I did because I wanted a certain kind of pacification in our. I still am idealistic that we can talk to each other, and the rhetoric, our political rhetoric, can in the mainstream certainly. I hope the switch from Trump to Biden will at least provide that. And again, the reason that the stuff in the streets isn't talked about is because the people that are off the streets think that they're aligned in a certain way, and they're not. It's when you keep trying to sort of get through to people is that this is something else. This is something else that has been brewing for a long time, and it's the anti-globalization, anti-capitalism stuff, but it's also the anti-racist stuff and a myriad of different groups who are involved, but unified in the sense that if you're not with us, then you're going to fall.
You're the enemy. Yes. Well, I think the irony here is that, yes, you can have all of these things that you oppose, racism, fascism, whatever it is that these people are marching against. The problem, the reason that this stuff resonates, the dysfunction actually comes from the corruption. And the corruption is, at the heart of the modern Democratic Party, and it is clearly at the heart of this emerging Biden administration. So, the one thing we are not talking about is the capture of our governance structures and the fact that it has made them dysfunctional, and it has created this massive wave of frustration that is now being misdirected at all kinds of either exaggerated enemies or fictional enemies or whatever it may be. But I'm certainly looking forward to the day when we actually start talking about what really isn't right. And what really isn't right is a corrupt political structure that creates a tremendous amount of rent-seeking and hoards opportunity. And, that may sound like a boring enemy. It's not, it doesn't feel as good to fight corruption as it does to fight Nazis. But, the corruption is real.
And this is why engage is also important. It's important to engage with people and young people that are disaffected and engage across the spectrum, really. And that's to have those conversations, and it would be great. If you engage, you realize that I think that a lot of people who are out on the streets would agree with you on that, on the right and the left. The people who are protesting, stop the steal, regardless of what you think about how that came about and so forth, they're dissatisfied with something in our government, and they don't trust our political system and structures. And that's the same.
Yep.
Not different. That's the same with the folks that are donning black. And I think you're going to see those tactics start to transmorph onto the other side.
Oh, I agree. There is something. There's always been something bizarrely similar. They dress very differently, but the dyed-in-the-wool libertarians and the dyed-in-the-wool anarchists believe something very similar. And yes, there's a much larger conversation to be had, and one that I hope will emerge, maybe in part in response to this discussion.
I hope so.
All right. Yeah, this has been great. Let's see. So, Jeremy Lee Quinn, where can people find you?
publicreport.org, and there'll be links there to my podcast, which is called Unblocked Podcast, and links to, Twitter and all of that, and all of the visual evidence since May.
All right.
Is laid out.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate your courage in speaking about this. I know that, I'm concerned about what might come of it, and I'm sure you are, but we have to continue to talk about it irrespective of what comes back. And I look forward to checking in with you as the story develops, and maybe, who knows, someone will contact one or both of us and be interested in having a conversation in which we can hear how things sound from the Antifa anarchist perspective.
Hey, the more conversations, the better.
Excellent. All right. Be well, everyone.